The Foden FD6, a supercharged two-stroke diesel with 6 conventional cylinders firing on every revolution of the crankshaft. At operating load, it screamed, a mechanical note produced by the roots blower and the two-stroke firing frequency that carried across a transport yard and identified itself without being seen. Owner-operators running heavy loads across the Pennines and Scottish Highlands swore by it. The engine was reliable, the torque delivery was continuous, and the sound told you more about what the engine was doing than any gauge. In 1980, Foden was sold to an American corporation. The FD6 had no place in the new product strategy. It was discontinued. By the end of this, you'll know exactly why the FD6 was discontinued and why the engine's performance had nothing to do with it. Most people assume it was killed by noise regulations or emission standards. It wasn't. It was discontinued because the company that built it was sold to a corporation whose product strategy had no place for a British two-stroke diesel. By the end of this, you'll understand what made the engine work commercially and what ended it, and why those two things had almost nothing in common. Foden Trucks was based in Sandbach, Cheshire. The company had started as a steam wagon manufacturer in the late 19th century, the kind of operation that built working machines for agricultural and haulage customers who valued durability over novelty. The move into diesel trucks came in the post-war years, and Foden positioned itself from the beginning as a premium manufacturer, building to customer specification rather than to mass-market catalog, producing trucks in hundreds per year rather than thousands, selling to operators who understood that a more expensive vehicle could be commercially rational over a long service life. Most British truck manufacturers of the period sourced their engines from established suppliers. Gardner, Cummins, AEC, and Rolls-Royce all supplied engines to multiple manufacturers. The component economics of buying a proven unit from a specialist made sense for a company whose competitive advantage was in chassis engineering and build quality rather than powertrain development. Foden chose a different path entirely. The FD series, Foden's proprietary diesel, was built in-house because Foden's management judged that control over the powertrain was inseparable from the premium proposition they were selling. An engine that anyone could buy from the same supplier was not a differentiator. An engine that only a Foden had was. The FD6 was a two-stroke diesel, 6 cylinders, each firing on every revolution of the crankshaft, not every other revolution, as in a 4-stroke cycle. A roots-type blower mounted on the engine provided the pressurized air charge that replaced the intake stroke the 2-stroke cycle eliminated. The exhaust ports uncovered as the piston descended, the scavenging air swept through, the piston rose and compressed the fresh charge. Fuel injected, combustion drove the piston down again. 2 strokes, 1 power event per revolution, per cylinder. The FD6 was not an opposed piston design. There was a conventional cylinder head at the top of each bore. The architecture was orthodox in every respect except the cycle. The consequence of that cycle was a torque delivery that 4-stroke operators noticed the first time they worked the engine on a gradient. A 4-stroke produces 1 power event every 2 revolutions in each cylinder. There is an interval. At low RPM under heavy load, that interval is long enough to register in the feel of the engine, a slight unevenness between firing events. The FD6 had no equivalent interval. Every revolution produced a power event in every cylinder. At sustained load on a long grade, the torque arrived continuously. British hauliers running loads across the Pennines and Scottish Highlands found this characteristic commercially meaningful. The engine pulled through conditions where a comparable 4-stroke asked significantly more of the driver. The other consequence was the sound. A late 1960s owner-operator on the A74 northbound, a Foden loaded to gross vehicle weight, the FD6 at full operating load on a rising gradient, the sound coming through the cab floor was not the low rumble of a conventional diesel. It was a high-pitched mechanical note, the roots blower's frequency and the 2 strokes firing rate, combining into a continuous mechanical scream. An experienced driver read that sound the way a doctor reads a pulse. The pitch told you the load. The evenness of the note told you the engine's condition. A change in the note before any gauge registered it told you something needed attention. The sound was not a liability to the operators who understood it, it was the instrument panel they trusted most. The operators who chose the FD6 understood exactly what they were buying. What nobody had anticipated was what happened when the logic that valued it stopped being the logic that controlled it. The owner-operators who ran FD6-powered Foddins were not buying on impulse. A Foddin was an expensive truck by the standards of the British haulage market in the 1950s and 1960s, priced above what a Leyland or an ERF cost at the point of purchase, and the difference was visible on the purchase order. The operators who chose Foddin anyway were making a calculation that ran further forward than the invoice. An engine with the FD6's reliability record running to high mileages between overhauls on the specific duty cycles of British long-haul work, Trans-Pennine routes, Scottish trunk roads, the heavy industrial hauls between the Midlands and the ports, returned a total operating cost over its service life that justified the premium. Not always. Not for every operator. For the ones doing the calculation correctly, over a 10-year horizon, the numbers worked. The calculation required understanding what the FD6 was doing at operating load. The hauliers who ran it across those routes were not managing a difficult engine. They were operating a tool that behaved predictably under the conditions it had been designed for, and predictability at sustained high load over long mileages was the specific quality their routes demanded. The FD6 did not ask the driver to nurse it. It asked the driver to understand it. The operators who made that distinction, and there were enough of them to sustain Foddin's order books through the 1950s and 1960s, constituted a customer base that valued what Foddin was selling. They were not the only operators interested in unconventional two-stroke diesels. The Commer TS3, the Roots Group engine fitted to Commer trucks from 1954, was running in the same market, serving the same owner-operators through a completely different architecture. Where the FD6 used conventional cylinders and a Roots blower to feed a standard port arrangement, the TS3 used an opposed piston design. 2 pistons per cylinder, no cylinder head, combustion forming in the space between them at closest approach. The acoustic result was similar, a high-pitched, characterful sound that experienced operators found informative and first-time bystanders found startling. The engineering paths were different. The commercial territory was the same. Both engines were building loyal followings in a market that was simultaneously consolidating around something neither of them represented. British Leyland, the product of a series of government-encouraged mergers through the 1960s, was absorbing the British truck industry at a rate that left few independents standing. AEC went into the Leyland structure, Albion went in, Scammell went in, Guy went in. The manufacturers that had defined British commercial vehicle engineering for 30 years were becoming product lines within a single corporate entity, their engineering identities subordinated to platform standardization and volume economics. Foddin was not absorbed. Foddin remained independent, a premium specialist operating outside the consolidation, sustained by the operator relationships the FD6 had built. That independence had a specific cost. Leyland's volume economics set the market's price reference point. Every operator comparison shopping between a Foddin and a Leyland equivalent was comparing a premium-priced bespoke truck against the purchasing power of the largest vehicle manufacturer in Britain. Foddin's response was to maintain the premium positioning, hold the quality standard, and rely on operators who understood the difference to keep buying. The FD6 was the mechanical argument that justified the premium, the proprietary engine that nobody else had, delivering the torque curve and the service life that the comparable Leyland-powered alternative couldn't match for the specific operators doing the specific work. Through the 1970s, the environment began to shift beneath that argument. European noise regulations were establishing standards that the FD6's acoustic signature would need engineering work to meet. Emissions requirements were forming. Turbocharged 4-stroke engines from Cummins and Rolls-Royce were producing higher power outputs in packages that operators outside the committed FD6 user base found easier to justify. The development capital required to advance the FD6 against those pressures came from a manufacturer producing hundreds of trucks per year, not thousands. Foden had survived by being something Leyland wasn't. The question was whether that remained enough when the terms of the comparison started changing. The development capital problem didn't resolve itself. Meeting the noise standards that European regulations were establishing required engineering work on the FD6's blower and intake system, work that cost roughly the same for a manufacturer producing hundreds of trucks per year as it did for one producing thousands, because the engineering process doesn't scale proportionally with volume. Each iteration that made the engine quieter narrowed the performance margins that had justified the premium. Each iteration cost money Foden didn't have in reserve. Foden was iterating an engine whose commercial logic depended on characteristics the regulatory environment was specifically targeting. Packer, the American parent of Kenworth and Peterbilt, acquired Foden in 1980. The strategic logic was visible. A premium bespoke manufacturer with a loyal operator base and a reputation built on total operating cost rather than purchase price was a profile Packer understood from its own operations. The FD6 was not part of what Packer wanted to carry forward. Packer's product strategy was organized around conventional four-stroke engines, Cummins, Caterpillar, Detroit Diesel, with international supply chains, established service networks, and parts availability that operators could rely on, regardless of where they broke down. The FD6 met none of those criteria. It was a proprietary British two-stroke diesel with a specialist knowledge base, a limited parts network, and no application outside the trucks it had been designed for. The decision to discontinue it was made on product strategy grounds, not because the engine had worn out, not because a Cummins exceeded it on what the operators who chose it valued, because the international product portfolio Packer was managing had no logical place for a British two-stroke diesel. The Commer TS3 had already gone. Chrysler's acquisition of the Roots Group had ended TS3 production in 1972. The opposed piston rival killed 8 years earlier by the same force through a different corporate sequence. Two British two-stroke diesels, built through entirely different engineering philosophies, sustained by operator loyalty, both ended by acquisition into corporations whose product strategies had no use for them. The category was gone before most of the people who had driven those trucks had finished their working careers. The FD6-powered Fodens already in service continued running. Parts availability narrowed as production ended and the supply chain wound down. The maintenance knowledge the engine required, injection timing set to the precise degree the fuel economy figures depended on, blower clearances held within tolerances that the acoustic signature told you had drifted before any gauge confirmed it, concentrated in fewer mechanics as the trucks aged out of service. Some of that knowledge was passed on deliberately to people who had decided the FD6 was worth understanding. Some retired with the engineers who held it. Some now exists only in the engines themselves and what they tell the people maintaining them when they run. FD6-powered Fodens appear at truck rallies. The sound that identified them, the continuous mechanical scream at operating load the Roots blowers note underneath, is unchanged from the A74 northbound in 1968. The crowd around a running FD6 goes quiet in a specific way. There is nothing else at a truck rally that sounds quite like it. The FD6 wasn't killed because it was too loud or too unusual. It was killed because the company that built it was acquired by a corporation whose international product strategy had no logical place for a British two-stroke diesel, and the engine that had run reliably across 3 decades of British heavy haulage ended without ever being exceeded on the measure its operators valued. What the FD6 story demonstrates is that an engine's survival depends on more than whether it works. It depends on whether the institution that makes it has a place in the market forming around it, and whether the logic that values it and the logic that controls its future are operating in the same frame. The operators understood the engine. The corporation that ended it understood a different set of priorities. Both were coherent. Only one of them determined what happened in 1980. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe, There are more of them.